Sometimes the people who save lives are the ones who almost lost their own. My name is Dr. Elena Rodriguez, and this is the story of how being abandoned during my darkest hour led me to revolutionize crisis intervention and save thousands of others from the same fate. But to understand how a psych ward discharge at 3 in the morning became the foundation for the most effective mental health response system in the country, we need to go back to where it all started. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Phoenix, I was the daughter who had it all figured out. My parents, both hardworking immigrants from El Salvador, had sacrificed everything to give my brother and me opportunities they never had. My father worked double shifts at the auto plant, while my mother cleaned office buildings at night. Their dream was simple: their children would become professionals, escape the cycle of struggle, and never have to worry about money the way they did. My brother Carlos followed the script perfectly. Pre-law at Arizona State, then law school. And now he's a successful corporate attorney in Dallas. He was the golden child, the one who validated every sacrifice my parents made. Then there was me, the one who seemed equally promising at first. Perfect grades, student council president, early acceptance to nursing school with a full scholarship. Everyone assumed I'd follow the same upward trajectory. What they didn't see were the nights I spent awake, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control, the way crowds made my chest tighten until I couldn't breathe. How I'd spend hours researching not just my nursing assignments, but everything about mental health, trauma response, and why the emergency department always seemed so inadequate when people came in during psychological crises. While my classmates studied anatomy and pharmacology, I was diving deep into crisis psychology, reading case studies about failed interventions, and documenting patterns I noticed during my clinical rotations. Elena spends too much time thinking about the difficult cases, my nursing supervisor noted during my third-year evaluation. She needs to focus on standard care protocols rather than questioning established procedures. But I couldn't stop noticing how many people left our emergency department in worse psychological condition than when they arrived. How security guards were called before mental health professionals. How families were often treated as obstacles rather than essential parts of the healing process. The tension at home was different from typical family pressure. My parents weren't pushing me toward medicine or law like some families might. They were worried about something else entirely. "Mija, you think too much about sad things," my mother would say, watching me take notes during late-night study sessions. "These troubled people, they're not your responsibility. Focus on becoming a good nurse, get a stable job, find a nice husband. Don't carry other people's problems on your shoulders." My father was more direct. "Elena, you're getting too involved with the psychiatric patients. That's not normal nursing. Those people need specialists, not you. You're going to burn yourself out before you even start your career." They saw my intense interest in mental health crisis intervention as an unhealthy obsession, something that would derail my promising future rather than enhance it. The breaking point came during my final year of nursing school. I had been working with a patient named Maria, a young mother who had been brought in after a suicide attempt. The standard protocol was stabilization, brief psychiatric evaluation, and discharge with outpatient referrals. But I noticed something the attending physician missed. Maria wasn't just depressed. She was exhibiting signs of postpartum psychosis, complicated by immigration-related trauma. Her family was terrified and didn't understand what was happening to her. I spent extra time with Maria and her family, explaining her condition, connecting them with culturally appropriate resources, and developing a safety plan that actually made sense for their situation. When Maria returned 2 weeks later, stable and grateful, she told me I had saved her life. Not through any medical intervention, but by seeing her as a complete person rather than just a set of symptoms. My nursing supervisor was furious. "Rodriguez, you overstepped boundaries and spent unauthorized time on non-nursing activities. This kind of behavior shows poor judgment and inability to follow protocols. You're here to learn nursing, not to play therapist." The incident went into my academic file as a disciplinary action. My clinical instructor recommended I consider transferring to a different specialization. suggesting that emergency and psychiatric nursing might not be suitable for someone with my emotional investment issues. That night, I called my parents to tell them about the disciplinary action. The conversation I had dreaded finally happened. "Elena, this is exactly what we were worried about," my father said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "You're too sensitive for this work. Maybe you should consider switching to pediatric nursing or something more stable. These mental health cases are affecting your judgment." My mother's response was even more painful. "Mia, Carlos never had these problems in law school. He focused on his studies and didn't get emotionally involved with clients. Maybe you're not suited for this kind of nursing. There's no shame in finding a different path." The implication was clear. I was failing not just academically but as a person. My deep empathy and innovative thinking, which I saw as strengths, were being labeled as weaknesses by everyone around me. But something inside me refused to accept their assessment. That weekend, I drove out to the desert hills outside Phoenix, a place I'd always gone to think clearly. Sitting on the warm rocks, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and purple, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to abandon my interest in crisis intervention. Instead, I was going to prove that my approach wasn't emotional instability. It was a more effective way of helping people during their most vulnerable moments. I started documenting everything. Every crisis intervention I observed, every family interaction, every successful de-escalation, and every failure. I noticed patterns that seemed invisible to others. Traditional crisis response focused on immediate symptom management and rapid discharge, but the patients who did best had something else. They had advocates who understood their cultural context, family dynamics, and individual triggers. They had people who saw their crisis as part of a larger story, not just an isolated incident requiring medical intervention. My grades began to suffer as I devoted more time to this independent research. While my classmates were focused on passing the NCLEX exam and securing job placements, I was developing what I privately called contextual crisis intervention, an approach that treated mental health emergencies as complex social and psychological events requiring comprehensive, culturally informed response rather than just medical stabilization. The final confrontation with my family came during Carlos's graduation celebration. The entire extended family was there, celebrating his successful completion of law school and his job offer from a prestigious firm. During dinner, my aunt asked about my post-graduation plans. When I mentioned my interest in specializing in psychiatric emergency nursing and possibly pursuing advanced degrees in crisis psychology, the table went quiet. "Elena has some very unique ideas about nursing," my mother said carefully, her tone suggesting these ideas were not entirely positive. "Carlos, perhaps trying to be supportive, suggested I consider more traditional nursing paths that would provide better job security and, quote, normal working hours." That's when I stood up and said something that surprised everyone, including myself. What if I told you that the current mental health crisis response system fails 60% of the people it's supposed to help? That families like ours, families who don't speak perfect English or understand complex medical systems, are routinely dismissed or inadequately served during psychological emergencies. What if my unique ideas could actually save lives? The room fell silent. My father looked uncomfortable, my mother worried, and Carlos wore the expression of someone trying to figure out how to diplomatically disagree with his sister. Finally, my father spoke. "Elena, you're still in school. You don't have enough experience to criticize entire medical systems. Focus on graduating and getting a job first. These big ideas about changing everything, they're not realistic for someone just starting their career." I looked around the table at my family. People I loved deeply but who couldn't see what I saw so clearly. "Dad, if I don't challenge these systems now, when will I? After 10 years of following protocols that don't work? After watching hundreds more families struggle through crises alone?" The conversation ended with uncomfortable silence and a changed dynamic that would persist for years. 2 weeks before graduation, everything fell apart. The stress of academic pressure, family disapproval, and my own unaddressed mental health needs finally caught up with me. I was working a night shift in the emergency department when I had what I now recognize as a severe panic attack triggered by acute stress reaction. My heart was racing, I couldn't catch my breath, and I felt completely disconnected from reality. The irony wasn't lost on me. The person who spent so much time thinking about mental health crisis was experiencing one herself. My supervising nurse, the same one who had written me up for over-involvement with Maria, took one look at me and made a decision that would haunt me for years. Instead of offering support or recognizing that I was experiencing a treatable crisis, she told me I was quote, 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 quote. When I tried to explain what was happening, she cut me off. Elena, this confirms what we've been worried about. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You're too emotionally unstable for emergency nursing. You need to seriously consider whether this profession is right for you. The next morning, my clinical instructor called to inform me that I was being removed from the program, pending a psychological evaluation. The school's position was that my episode demonstrated inadequate emotional regulation for patient care responsibilities. They offered me the option to withdraw voluntarily to avoid having a dismissal on my academic record, but either way, my nursing career was over before it began. When I called my parents to tell them what happened, the response was devastatingly predictable. "Maybe this is for the best," my mother said gently. "Maybe this is a sign that you should try something else, something less stressful. You've been pushing yourself too hard with all these ideas about changing mental health care. Perhaps it's time to step back and reconsider your path." 3 days later, I found myself sitting in my car outside a community mental health center in Tempe, holding a crumpled referral paper and wondering how my life had unraveled so completely. The school counselor had given me the address along with a lecture about appropriate career alternatives for people with your sensitivity levels. The dismissal was final. 4 years of education, perfect clinical grades until that last semester, and dreams of changing emergency mental health care had evaporated in a single night. The therapist I eventually started seeing, Dr. Jennifer Kim, was unlike anyone I had encountered in the medical system. She didn't immediately try to medicate my anxiety or suggest I abandon my career goals. Instead, she asked questions that no one else had thought to ask. "Elena, tell me about what you observed in those emergency departments that others weren't seeing. Walk me through what you think should have happened differently." Over the following months, something unexpected began to emerge from our sessions. As I processed my own crisis experience, I started to understand crisis intervention from an entirely new perspective. I had lived through exactly what I had been trying to fix: the gap between what people in crisis actually need and what the system provides. My panic attack wasn't just a personal failure. It was a perfect case study in how mental health emergencies are misunderstood and mishandled. Dr. Kim introduced me to a concept that would reshape everything: lived experience as professional qualification rather than disqualification. "Elena, you've been told that your emotional investment and personal understanding of crisis makes you unsuitable for this work. What if it actually makes you more qualified than people who have never experienced what your patients are going through?" During this time, I took a job as a medical transcriptionist to pay rent and avoid moving back with my parents. The work was mind-numbing, but it gave me access to thousands of crisis intervention reports from hospitals across Arizona. I started analyzing them systematically, looking for patterns in what worked and what didn't. What I discovered was startling. The most successful interventions had several common elements that weren't part of standard training. Successful crisis interventions involved family members as partners, rather than obstacles. They addressed cultural and linguistic barriers proactively. They treated housing, employment, and social supports as medical issues rather than social work problems. Most importantly, they were conducted by teams that included people with lived experience of mental health crises, not just academic credentials. Armed with this data, I started reaching out to community organizations that worked with Latino families facing mental health emergencies. I volunteered as a translator and advocate, unofficially at first. What I found was a parallel system of crisis support happening completely outside of traditional medical settings. Church leaders, community health workers, and family networks were providing effective interventions using approaches that hospital staff had never been trained in. Maria Santos, a community health promoter in South Phoenix, became my first real mentor in this work. She had been supporting families through mental health crises for 15 years, without any formal training in psychology or nursing. Her success rate was remarkable, Families she worked with had lower hospitalization rates, better medication compliance, and stronger support systems than those who went through traditional emergency interventions alone. Maria told me during one of our coffee meetings, the problem isn't that the doctors don't care, it's that they don't understand how our families work. They see crisis as medical emergency, but for us, crisis is family emergency. You can't treat the person without treating the family, and you can't treat the family without understanding the community. This insight sparked what I now recognize as my breakthrough moment. What if crisis intervention teams included community health workers, peer specialists, and family advocates as equal partners with medical professionals? What if we treated mental health emergencies as community events requiring community solutions, supported by medical expertise rather than dominated by it? I started developing what I privately called community-integrated crisis response. The model involved rapid deployment teams that included a medical professional, a peer specialist with lived experience, a community health worker familiar with the family's cultural background, and a family advocate trained in de-escalation and resource navigation. Each team member had specific roles, but they worked together to address both immediate safety concerns and underlying system issues that contributed to the crisis. My first opportunity to test this approach came through Maria's network. A family in Maryvale was dealing with their teenage son's first psychotic episode. The hospital had discharged him with medication and an outpatient referral, but the family was terrified and had no idea how to help him. Traditional crisis hotlines weren't answering in Spanish, and the outpatient clinic had a 6-week waiting list. Working with Maria and 2 other community advocates, we created an informal intervention that addressed every aspect of the crisis. We provided immediate safety planning and medication education in Spanish, connected the family with culturally appropriate mental health services, helped them navigate insurance and disability systems, and established ongoing support through their church community. Most importantly, we treated the parents as experts on their son rather than obstacles to his treatment. 3 months later, the young man was stable, attending community college, and volunteering with our informal crisis team. His family had become advocates for other Latino families facing similar situations. When I compared his outcome to similar cases handled through traditional emergency interventions, the difference was striking. Not only had we achieved better clinical outcomes with lower costs, but we had strengthened the entire family system and connected them to ongoing community supports. Word about our success began spreading through community networks. Families started reaching out directly when crises occurred, bypassing emergency departments entirely for initial support. Social workers and case managers began referring families to our informal team when traditional interventions weren't working. Even some emergency department staff started calling Maria when they had Latino families in crisis and weren't sure how to help effectively. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Williams, the Director of Behavioral Health at Phoenix General Hospital, had been tracking readmission rates and noticed that families who had received our community-based interventions had significantly lower rates of repeat emergency visits. She reached out to Maria, who connected her with me. "Elena," Dr. Williams said during our first meeting, "I've been working in emergency psychiatry for 20 years, and I've never seen outcomes like this. What you're doing isn't just effective. It's revolutionary. We need to talk about how to scale this approach and integrate it into formal crisis response systems." That conversation changed everything. Dr. Williams wasn't just interested in our methods. She wanted to hire me as a consultant to redesign their entire crisis intervention program. She had funding through a state grant to pilot innovative approaches to mental health emergency response, and our community-integrated model was exactly what they had been looking for. My family's reaction was predictably mixed. When I told them about the consulting opportunity, my mother's first response was relief that I would finally have steady income and health insurance. My father was pleased that a real doctor had recognized my work. But Carlos, ever the lawyer, had concerns about liability and whether I was qualified to advise medical professionals without formal credentials. "Elena, I'm proud that you've found a way to help people," he said during one of our phone calls, "but consulting for hospitals requires expertise and credentials. Are you sure you're not getting in over your head? Maybe you should consider going back to school for social work or psychology before taking on this kind of responsibility." His concerns weren't entirely wrong. I didn't have the traditional qualifications for healthcare consulting, but I had something else. Data showing that my approach worked better than existing methods, lived experience of both crisis and recovery, and deep knowledge of community systems that most healthcare professionals never encounter. Dr. Williams had made it clear that she was hiring me precisely because I brought perspectives that couldn't be learned in graduate school. The pilot program at Phoenix General launched 6 months later. We implemented community-integrated crisis teams for all Spanish-speaking families, and any families specifically requesting peer support. The teams operated 24/7, with community health workers and peer specialists receiving the same priority status as medical personnel. Family advocates were trained in both clinical basics and community resource navigation. Initial results exceeded everyone's expectations. Emergency department length of stay decreased by 40% for families using our teams. Readmission rates dropped by 60%. Patient satisfaction scores increased dramatically, but more importantly, families reported feeling respected, understood, and empowered rather than overwhelmed and dismissed. The success attracted attention from other hospitals and state agencies. Within a year, we were training crisis intervention teams for medical centers throughout Arizona. Mental health advocacy organizations began requesting presentations about our model. Academic conferences invited me to speak about community-integrated crisis response, despite my lack of traditional credentials. Dr. Kim, my therapist who had helped me see my crisis experience as qualification rather than disqualification, summed it up perfectly during one of our sessions. Elena, you've proven that sometimes the people who have been hurt by broken systems are the ones best positioned to fix them. Your crisis wasn't a career-ending event. It was preparation for the career you were meant to have. Standing in the emergency department at Phoenix General, watching one of our crisis teams work with a family whose father was experiencing his first manic episode, I felt a sense of purpose I had never experienced during nursing school. The team moved with practiced coordination. The peer specialist talking with the father about his own recovery journey, the community health worker explaining the situation to extended family members in their native language, the medical resident focusing on immediate safety and medication needs, and the family advocate helping everyone understand next steps and available resources. This was what crisis intervention could look like when it treated people as whole human beings connected to families and communities, rather than isolated patients with symptoms. The father would be stabilized and connected to ongoing care, but his family would also be empowered to support his recovery and prepared to recognize early warning signs. The community would gain another family committed to reducing mental health stigma and supporting others facing similar challenges. My phone buzzed with a text from Carlos. Saw the news article about your program. Mom and Dad are showing it to all their friends. We're proud of you, Hermana. You were right all along about needing to do things differently. 5 years later, I stood before an audience of 300 mental health professionals at the National Crisis Intervention Conference in Denver, preparing to deliver the keynote address about community-integrated crisis response. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who had been dismissed from nursing school for being too emotionally involved was now considered a leading expert in crisis intervention innovation. The transformation had been remarkable and rapid. Our Arizona pilot program had caught the attention of the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, leading to federal funding for implementation in 12 states. Major medical centers from Seattle to Miami were sending their crisis teams to Phoenix for training. Medical schools had begun incorporating our community integration principles into their emergency psychiatry curricula. But the real measure of success wasn't in conference presentations or federal grants. It was in the data that kept pouring in from hospitals across the country. Emergency departments using our model reported consistent improvements: decreased use of restraints and involuntary holds, reduced police involvement in mental health calls, shorter crisis resolution times, and most importantly, dramatically lower rates of repeated emergency visits. Families weren't just getting through crises, they were emerging stronger and more connected to ongoing support systems. Dr. Williams, who had become both mentor and collaborator, joined me at the podium to present our latest research findings. Elena Rodriguez didn't just develop a new crisis intervention model, she told the audience. She fundamentally challenged our assumptions about who is qualified to provide mental health care and what effective intervention actually looks like. The results speak for themselves. When we include people with lived experience as equal partners in crisis response, everyone benefits. The presentation included case studies that demonstrated the power of our approach. There was Miguel, a construction worker whose PTSD flashbacks had led to 3 emergency room visits in 2 months before our team connected him with veteran peer counselors and culturally appropriate trauma therapy. Sandra, a single mother whose postpartum depression had been complicated by immigration fears, until our family advocate helped her access services without risking her legal status. David, a college student whose bipolar disorder had derailed his education until our team worked with his university to develop accommodations and support systems. Each story represented not just individual recovery but family healing and community strengthening. Miguel had become a peer counselor himself, working with other Latino veterans. Sandra was training as a community health worker specializing in maternal mental health. David had started a campus organization supporting students with mental health conditions. The ripple effects continued expanding as people who had received community-integrated crisis support became advocates and helpers for others. During the question-and-answer session, a hospital administrator from Portland raised her hand. Dr. Rodriguez, your model clearly works, but implementing it requires significant cultural change within medical institutions. How do you convince traditional healthcare professionals to share authority with community workers and peer specialists who don't have formal medical training? I smiled, remembering my own resistance to being helped by people outside the traditional medical system. The key is demonstrating that including community expertise doesn't diminish medical authority, it enhances medical effectiveness. When families trust the intervention team and understand the treatment plan, medical recommendations are followed more consistently. When peer specialists help patients see recovery as possible, medication compliance improves. When community health workers address social determinants of mental health, medical symptoms often resolve more quickly. Another questioner, a young resident from Chicago, asked about handling family resistance to mental health intervention. Sometimes families don't want outside involvement in crisis situations. How do you respect cultural values while ensuring patient safety? This question touched the heart of everything I had learned. Resistance usually comes from previous negative experiences with systems that didn't understand or respect family values. When intervention teams include people who share cultural backgrounds and speak native languages, when they treat family members as partners rather than obstacles, resistance transforms into collaboration. Safety improves when families feel empowered rather than excluded. After the presentation, I was surrounded by people wanting to share their own stories and implementation questions. A social worker from New Mexico described adapting our model for Native American communities. A crisis counselor from Alabama talked about training peer specialists in rural areas where traditional mental health services were scarce. A nursing educator from Canada asked about incorporating community integration principles into undergraduate curricula. But the most meaningful conversation came with a young woman who approached me during the reception. Dr. Rodriguez, I'm finishing my master's in social work, and I've been struggling with whether to disclose my own history with mental health treatment. Your story gives me hope that lived experience can be a professional strength rather than something to hide. I knew exactly what she meant. What's your name? I asked. Isabella Martinez. I'm specializing in adolescent crisis intervention, and I keep seeing gaps in how we serve Latino families. But my supervisors worry that my personal connection to the community might compromise my professional objectivity. Her situation was painfully familiar. Isabella, let me tell you something I wish someone had told me 15 years ago. Your personal understanding of crisis and recovery isn't a liability. It's your greatest professional asset. The question isn't whether you should hide your experience, but how you can use it ethically and effectively to improve care for others. We talked for an hour about strategies for integrating lived experience into professional practice, about building credibility through demonstrated competence, and about finding mentors who understood the value of diverse perspectives in mental health care. When Isabella left, she had my contact information and an invitation to visit our training program in Phoenix. The next morning, I received a call that brought everything full circle. Dr. Susan Chen, the Dean of Nursing at Arizona State University, wanted to discuss developing a new specialty track in community-integrated crisis nursing. Elena, we've been following your work closely, and we believe it's time to formalize training in your approach. We'd like you to design and lead a certificate program that would prepare nurses to work in community-integrated crisis teams. The opportunity was extraordinary, but it also felt like vindication for every student who had been told their empathy was excessive or their community connections were unprofessional. We would be training the next generation of crisis nurses to see family involvement, cultural competence, and lived experience as essential skills rather than optional extras. My parents' evolution had been as dramatic as my professional success. The woman who had once worried that my interest in mental health was unhealthy now introduced me to her friends as my daughter, the doctor who helps families during psychological emergencies. My father, who had questioned whether crisis intervention was real nursing work, now proudly displayed newspaper articles about our program in his workshop. The most powerful moment of family reconciliation came during a visit home for Christmas. My nephew, Carlos's 8-year-old son, was struggling with anxiety about starting at a new school. Instead of dismissing his concerns or immediately seeking medical intervention, the family called me for advice. We had a family meeting where everyone, including my nephew, discussed strategies for managing anxiety and building support systems. "Tia Elena," my nephew said afterward, "you make scary feelings seem less scary by talking about them." It was the simplest and most accurate description of crisis intervention I had ever heard. Carlos pulled me aside later that evening. "Elena, I owe you an apology. When you were struggling in nursing school, I thought you needed to be more practical, more focused on traditional career paths. I didn't understand that you were seeing problems the rest of us missed, and developing solutions we didn't know we needed. Your work has saved families like ours from unnecessary suffering." My mother's transformation was even more profound. She had started volunteering with our family advocate training program, using her own experiences as an immigrant parent to help other families navigate crisis situations. "Mija," she told me, "I spent so many years worrying that your sensitivity would hurt your career. Now I see that your sensitivity is your career. You help families the way I wish someone had helped us when we were struggling." The program continued expanding beyond anyone's expectations. By the end of that year, community-integrated crisis teams were operating in 26 states. The National Institute of Mental Health had funded a multi-site research study to evaluate our approach compared to traditional crisis intervention. International delegations were visiting Phoenix to learn about adapting our model for their healthcare systems. But growth brought new challenges. Maintaining quality while scaling rapidly required intensive training and ongoing supervision. Some hospitals implemented superficial versions of our approach without understanding the fundamental cultural shifts required. A few state agencies tried to mandate community integration without providing adequate funding or training. Each implementation challenge taught us something important about sustainable change in healthcare systems. Real transformation required more than new protocols. It demanded shifts in power dynamics, resource allocation, and professional identity. Medical professionals had to learn to share authority. Community workers needed clinical training and institutional support. Families required education about their rights and roles in crisis intervention. The most rewarding aspect of the work remained individual success stories. Like Teresa, a grandmother whose grandson's substance abuse and mental health crisis had torn apart their extended family until our team helped them understand addiction as a medical condition requiring family support rather than family shame. Or James, a veteran whose suicide attempt had led to involuntary hospitalization until our peer specialist helped him develop a safety plan that honored his autonomy while ensuring his protection. These stories reminded me why I had originally been drawn to crisis intervention work. Every successful intervention represented not just symptom management or crisis resolution, but human dignity preserved, family relationships healed, and community connections strengthened. When people felt heard, understood, and supported during their most vulnerable moments, they emerged more resilient and more connected to ongoing recovery resources. Standing in my office at the Crisis Innovation Center we had established in downtown Phoenix, looking at thank you letters from families served by teams trained in our approach, I reflected on the journey from that terrible night when I was dismissed from nursing school. The experience that was supposed to end my healthcare career had actually prepared me for work I never could have imagined. My phone rang with another consultation request, this time from a children's hospital in Boston wanting to adapt our model for pediatric mental health emergencies. As I prepared to discuss implementation strategies with their crisis team director, I thought about Isabella Martinez and all the other young professionals who were learning that their lived experiences and community connections weren't obstacles to overcome, but strengths to cultivate. The work was far from finished. Millions of families still faced mental health crises without adequate support. Many communities remained underserved by traditional mental health systems. Healthcare institutions continued to struggle with integrating community perspectives into clinical practice. But the foundation had been laid for a fundamentally different approach to crisis intervention, one that honored both medical expertise and community wisdom. Tomorrow I would train another cohort of crisis team members, review data from our latest implementation sites, and respond to emails from mental health professionals around the world who are adapting our principles to their local contexts. Each day brought new opportunities to demonstrate that effective crisis intervention requires not just clinical skills, but cultural competence, community partnerships, and deep respect for the families and individuals we serve. The girl who was once told she was too sensitive for healthcare had learned that sensitivity, when combined with skills and systems thinking, could transform entire fields of practice. Every crisis successfully resolved, every family empowered, every community strengthened, proved that sometimes the people who have been hurt by broken systems are exactly the ones needed to fix them. 10 years have passed since that keynote presentation in Denver, and the landscape of crisis intervention has transformed beyond recognition. Community-integrated crisis response is now the standard of care in over 40 states, with international adaptations operating in Canada, Australia, and several European countries. What started as an informal collaboration with Maria Santos in South Phoenix has become a movement reshaping how societies respond to mental health emergencies. The numbers tell an incredible story. Emergency departments using our approach report 70% fewer involuntary psychiatric holds, 80% reduction in police involvement for mental health calls, and crisis resolution times cut in half. But the statistics that matter most to me are different. 92% of families report feeling respected and empowered during crisis interventions, and 60% of people who receive community-integrated support become advocates for others facing similar challenges. Last month, I received the highest honor of my career, though it didn't come from any professional organization or government agency. Isabella Martinez, the young social worker I met at that conference years ago, sent me a photo of her own keynote presentation at the International Crisis Intervention Summit. She's now directing a statewide training program in New Mexico, adapting our principles for indigenous communities. The photo showed her standing confidently at the podium, with a caption that read, "Teaching others that our stories of struggle become our stories of strength." That image captures everything our movement represents. The people dismissed as too sensitive, too emotional, too involved, are now leading the transformation of mental health care. Peer specialists who were once patients are training medical residents. Community health workers who learned through experience are educating university professors. Families who survived crises are designing better intervention systems. My nephew, now 18 and heading to college, recently told me he wants to study psychology with a focus on community mental health. Tia Elena, you showed me that helping people isn't just about having the right degree. It's about understanding what they really need and having the courage to do things differently. He carries with him lessons about mental health that took me decades to learn. Growing up in a family that talks openly about emotional wellness and sees seeking help as strength rather than weakness, the Crisis Innovation Center has become a pilgrimage site for mental health professionals from around the world. We host training programs, research initiatives, and policy development sessions that continue pushing the boundaries of what crisis intervention can accomplish. Our latest project involves developing rapid response teams for climate-related mental health emergencies, recognizing that environmental disasters create psychological trauma requiring specialized community-based intervention. Dr. Williams, now in her 70s, continues working with our research team documenting the long-term impacts of community-integrated crisis care. Her latest study follows families for 5 years after initial crisis intervention, showing sustained improvements in mental health outcomes, family functioning, and community engagement. Elena, she told me recently, You didn't just change how we respond to mental health crises. You changed how we think about healing itself. My parents have become unexpected ambassadors for mental health awareness in their retirement community. They speak at senior centers about recognizing depression and anxiety in older adults, sharing resources for families supporting loved ones with mental health conditions. My father, the man who once worried that my interest in psychiatric nursing was impractical, now volunteers as a crisis team translator, using his medical background and bilingual skills to help Spanish-speaking families navigate emergency interventions. The work continues evolving. Next month, we launch our first virtual reality training program, allowing crisis intervention teams to practice de-escalation techniques in simulated family environments. We're developing artificial intelligence tools to help emergency departments identify families who would benefit from community-integrated support. Our mobile crisis units are expanding into rural communities that have never had access to specialized mental health emergency services. But the most meaningful developments happen in individual moments, like yesterday when I received a call from a mother in Tucson whose teenage daughter was experiencing her first panic attack. Instead of rushing to the emergency room, she contacted our crisis hotline and worked with a peer specialist who talked her through supporting her daughter at home while connecting them to ongoing resources. The crisis that might have traumatized the entire family became an opportunity for connection and education. These are the victories that sustain me. Families discovering their own resilience, communities learning to support their most vulnerable members, and young professionals realizing that their personal experiences with mental health can become professional superpowers rather than career limitations. As I write this, I'm preparing for another presentation, this time to a joint session of Congress, about the need for federal funding to expand community-integrated crisis services nationwide. The girl who was once told she was too emotionally unstable for nursing will be addressing lawmakers about the economic and social benefits of treating mental health crises as community events requiring community solutions. The transformation isn't complete. Too many families still face crises alone. Too many communities lack adequate mental health emergency services. And too many healthcare systems resist, including lived experience voices in crisis response. But the foundation is solid, the evidence is overwhelming, and the movement continues growing. To anyone reading this who has been told their sensitivity is weakness, their personal struggles disqualify them from helping others, or their unconventional ideas about healing are impractical, I want you to know, the world needs exactly what you have to offer. Your crisis might be preparation for your calling. Your wounds might become your wisdom. Your different perspective might be precisely what broken systems need to finally heal. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.